History of Armageddon, Codex Armageddon, written by Andy Chambers, Jervis Johnson, and Gavin Thorpe. Pages 2 and 3. Narrated by R.J. Bailey. The hive world of Armageddon, the principal world in the Armageddon sector, lies roughly 10,000 light-years to the galactic northeast of Terra. It is a vital node at the center of the Armageddon sector's navigational channels, and its thousands of weapons shops supply arms to Imperial Guard regiments, several thousand light-years away. The loss of Armageddon would pose a serious threat to the Imperium's power in this area of the galaxy, as was proved when a massive Chaos host invaded in the mid-41st millennium. Although that titanic battle has long since passed into history, a more recent conflict has shown how vulnerable the Imperium's control is. In 941 M41, the Orc warlord, Ghazghul Thraka, invaded Armageddon at the head of a massive Orc warg. At the time, Armageddon was under the command of Overlord Hermann von Strab, who was once described by Princeps Prime Curtis Mannheim of the Iron Skull's Titan Legion as the greatest waste of flesh and bone born in the last 500 years. It was von Strab's complete lack of preparation that cost the Imperium dearly. Even when a hulk of massive size was sighted in the Armageddon system, von Strab did nothing to investigate or report its appearance to other Imperial authorities. When the Orcs crashed onto the western continent of Armageddon Prime, von Strab sent out his planetary defense regiments piecemeal, and they were smashed to pieces by the vastly superior Orc armies. Armageddon Prime quickly capitulated. Its supply lines were cut, and Orc warriors stormed through the tunnels of its hives. It was Commissar Yarrick who ordered the astropaths to send a signal for aid, which earned him von Strab's displeasure and his subsequent exile to Hades' hive. However, it was this act which was to ultimately save Armageddon from falling to Ghazghul. Von Strab was not concerned with the loss of Armageddon Prime, declaring that the Orcs would never be able to cross the thick jungles that separated them from Armageddon Secundus. He was wrong. Ghazghul's forces swept out of the jungles and embarked on a massive conquest, crossing the Styges and Diabolus rivers and marching on the hives of Armageddon Secundus. Von Strab ordered Princeps Mannheim to lead his Titans into battle against the Orc armies, unsupported by other forces. Mannheim had little choice but to obey, though he knew that it would lead to the destruction of his forces. Although they inflicted heavy casualties on the Orcs, the Legio Metallica were all but annihilated by the numerous Orc gargants that opposed them. Everywhere the Imperial forces were being driven back in disarray. The Orcs swept onwards, storming Infernus Hive as the season of storms broke in full fury. Refugees numbering in tens of thousands marched across the inhospitable ash dunes, dying from exposure to the harsh environment, or falling prey to the rampaging mobs of Orc speed freaks, which constantly harried them in their flight. As the Orcs moved southwards, they split, descending on the Hades and Hell's Reach hives. When the Orcs besieged the massive cities, von Strab unleashed a secret weapon, a massive stock of virus bombs from his personal arsenals. However, the ancient devices frequently malfunctioned, and although they took a heavy toll of the unprotected Orcs, many humans were lost too, as missiles flew out of control and plunged into Imperium lines or exploded in the refugee camps. At Hell's Reach, converted supertankers took those unable to fight across the Tempest Ocean, and, once the last ship had left, those who remained grimly swore to defend the city to the last man. Suicide teams charged into the Orc encampments and detonated homemade explosives, while the dockside loaders welded themselves into the armored cabs of their cranes and fought with the gigantic gargants rampaging across the city. The fighting was bitter, but in the end, Hell's Reach fell to the orcs. Although the battle for Armageddon had been ferocious, it was at Hades' Hive that the conflict entered a new stage of savagery and fierceness. Led by Commissar Yarrick, the defenders of Hades' Hive fought as though they were possessed. The orcs made so little headway against such stiff resistance that Ghazghul himself joined the attack, leading his forces from the front. Thus, the stage was set for the greatest contest of wills in the entire war. For weeks, Ghazghul tried every stratagem taught to him by Gork and Mork, making lightning assaults and feints, attacking in massive waves, and trying to reduce the hive by bombardment. Yarrick countered every ploy, sending out sabotage parties to destroy the Orc warlord's siege engines, counter-attacking along a flank when the orcs tried to storm the barricades, and falling back from diversionary attacks to draw the orcs into ambushes. When Ghazghul mustered all of his commandos into a huge infiltration force, Yarrick assembled volunteer cadres of men who were once maintenance workers in the labyrinth of the hive's air and fuel ducts. A deadly battle was fought in the darkness between these drug-crazed psychopaths and the orc commandos, and in the end, it is said that not a single commando escaped alive. As Yarrick and Ghazghul fought over Hades, the remaining orc columns rumbled southwards towards the only other surviving settlements, Acheron and Tartarus. At Acheron, as the orcs made their assault, the defenders swore to die rather than surrender. Such dedication was admirable, but, in the end, unnecessary. The orcs were ripped asunder by the thunder of bombs and the crash of gigantic cannons, as the sky overhead filled with the shapes of Space Marine Thunderhawk gunships. The Blood Angels led the reinforcements, the military commanders of Armageddon ignoring von Strab's authority to follow Dante's legendary leadership. Von Strab was arrested for his crimes against the Imperium, though he later escaped. With the coming of the Ultramarines, Salamanders, and Blood Angels, the tide began to turn on Armageddon. The factories of Acheron and Tartarus churned out weapons and vehicles by their thousands, while the Space Marines began to force the orcs to retreat from the south. If Ghazghul had turned his attention southwards and made immediate plans to thwart this sudden counterattack, Armageddon may have still fallen. However, the siege of Hades' Hive had become something more than simply a military objective. Yarrick's uncompromising resistance challenged Ghazghul's ability and reputation as a warlord, a challenge he could not back down from. The Orc warlord gathered every available warband to his army, and, with this almighty force, fell upon Hades' Hive with the hatred an Orc only reserves for his greatest enemy. Despite desperate rationing, supplies in Hades' Hive had all but run out, and seeing the mass of orcs preparing to attack, Yarrick decided that the city could no longer stand. Those who could be were evacuated by daring shuttle runs, risking the orc anti-aircraft fire and interceptors to escape. The Space Marines arrived too late to save Hades, attacking the orcs even as they smashed their way inside. Yarrick was almost slain, but his iron will stopped him succumbing to the near-mortal wounds he had suffered. Whilst the fate of Hades was being sealed, Ghazghul revealed the true extent of his cunning. Masses of orc reinforcements poured in from the west, intent upon Tartarus' Hive in the south. If Tartarus was overrun, the industrial power in the south would be smashed, and the orcs could easily consolidate their position while the imperial armies were being moved down from the north. As the orcs assaulted Tartarus, their vanguard already pushing into the streets of the Hive City, Dante made his move. Transporting his Blood Angels back to their orbiting ships, he led a massive drop-pod assault into the heart of the orcs. Though horrendously outnumbered, the Blood Angels set to massacring any orc unlucky enough to be caught by them. Fueled by their righteous hatred, the Blood Angels slew nearly half of the entire orc army, and it was rumored that Ghazghkull himself had been felled, though this later proved to be false. Leaderless and assaulted on all sides by the Emperor's forces, the orcs refused to surrender. Some fought to the death, others slipped into the ash wastes, and eventually made their way to the jungles between the two continents of Armageddon. As is the way with orcs, the greenskins were never fully eradicated from Armageddon, and it is unlikely that they ever will be. In the depths of the jungles and in the ruins of fallen hives, they continue to breed, only to be hunted down by Imperial kill teams. Hades' hive still lies shattered, whilst the rebuilding of Tartarus and Infernus has only just begun. The legacies of the second battle for Armageddon are still plain to see. You have been listening to History of Armageddon, Codex Armageddon, pages 2 and 3. Codex Armageddon was written by Andy Chambers, Jervis Johnson, and Gavin Thorpe, and narrated by R.J. Bailey. Thank you to Andy Chambers, Jervis Johnson, and Gav Thorpe for writing the fiction I grew up with. If you've enjoyed this, please leave a review where you found it, or like, share, and subscribe on YouTube, depending how you're listening. You can follow me on Twitter at RJ Bailey. This production, like all of Oldex, is entirely unofficial and uncommercial. From an out-of-print publication, is a derivative work with all copyrights owned by Games Workshop, and is a celebration of the hobby and lore I grew up with. If you have suggestions for other old Codex fiction for me to narrate on this podcast, you can comment, contact me on Twitter at rjbailey, or email robertjbailey@gmail.com. Links are in the show description.